You're watching the Global Gambit, everyone, and you're watching the Silicon Curtain because we are joined in this co-stream with Jonathan Fink, founder of the great podcast and show on YouTube, Silicon Curtain. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm absolutely great. There might be a small delay, I have to point out. My audience will be seeing this later tonight because I've got a couple of things queued up for this time slot, but they will see it today, so it still will be fresh, but not exactly live. Oh, they are seeing it on Substack, though. Yeah, they're seeing it on Substack, not on the Silicon Curtain yet.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's good to do this. We do this occasionally.
We do.
Now, where to start, really? Goodness me, how many factories of wild berries are left, do you think?
I mean, listening to they've got a few left, but obviously the top 5 by Abyom or volume have been hit. And we saw with refineries that once those go, it's not that the others are off the hook. It's just that they're still to come. There's a sword of Damocles hanging over the whole lot. There was extraordinary, and this is interesting, and I'll bounce this back to you. It seems that there are many, I'm sure there are many in Russia who know exactly what's going on. Of course, they don't post videos to TikTok and they don't make themselves look like idiots. But there are a number of people who are coming on and go, well, why has this happened to us? And then some of them will root around for the most convoluted excuses because they cannot name the obvious thing, that their Tsar God has embarked on a ludicrous and senseless war, that he's failed to accept that sort of a stalemate or defeat was inevitable from 2023 onwards. But they can't name that. Maybe even consciously they can't accept that. So they reach around for the bizarrest things. And one of the most toxic I saw, which gave me a little bit of a throwback to 1998 because I experienced the same thing, is that someone said, well, do you know why Wildberries is being hit and not Ozon and all the other warehouse distributors or marketplaces as they're called? It's because this is the only one not owned by Jews. So that was an extraordinary accusation that went there. And it reminded me a little bit of 1998 during the financial crisis, where there was an upswing of muggings and violence, racism, and I have to say anti-Semitism as well. So it seems that people under this pressure in that kind of environment, that kind of dictatorship, will often not look for the most obvious causes, but they will sometimes root around for dark conspiracies. But rest assured, all the other brands of marketplace are going to go down in the next couple of weeks. I think that's pretty much guaranteed.
Yeah, I think it's one of those cases where the Russians, military bloggers at least I've seen, are trying to argue that this is illegal war. It's humanitarian. It's striking civilian sites, but I think it's pretty clear that Wildberries and those affiliated companies have been used as, should we say, holding sites for weapons.
Huge, yeah. I think CNN identified 78,000 direct military-related product lines on offer in the Wildberries inventory. So yes, of course, Russia has, I think, gone from having severely undeveloped logistics, and it's springboarded right into the 21st century. But this is an interesting paradigm here. It suggests that Vladimir Putin, who doesn't understand these things, doesn't understand or even care about a modern economy, has got Russia into a war that is incompatible with a modern digital economy. And this is what we're seeing play out. What it also means, I think, is that Russia will, because they skipped that step of, the service industry and development of logistics over decades, they springboarded into this sort of advanced marketplaces. It means that when they're pushed back, they're going to go right back to the 90s or the 80s or the 70s. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing over the coming months.
Yeah, I recall from when I first started studying Russia in my undergrad, this was about 2012, and there was signs that the economy was beginning to modernize quite a lot. Russia was leading, or claiming it was leading, in some areas of advanced industry. But Putin's decision to annex Crimea and generally the policy shifts that he made led to the sanctions. And those sanctions have obviously reversed the fortunes of the Russian economy, which was growing reasonably well in the early 2010s. So now,
yes.
as you
and
say,
life expectancy along with that was improving up until about 2012. then it started to go into abeyance again. So
Yeah.
there's a whole range of stats that do support what you've said there. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I'm saying, so if we look at just simply the reverse effect that this war is having on the digital transformation of the economy, i.e. not, versus what we've seen with Ukraine and the shifts in the country in only 4 years. And obviously I want to get into your thoughts a little bit about Fedorov and the new appointments. But yeah, it's a real compounding effect of how much Russia's declining in certain domestic industry versus the progress of Ukraine despite the war on it in its backyard. And obviously it's coming home to Moscow now. So actually I want your thoughts on something. I don't know if you saw a clip, maybe some other viewers have seen it, but Putin, I think, is currently in Kazakhstan. He met Tokayev, and Tokayev was apparently even saying to him, maybe it's about time you thought about winding this war down. And Putin's reaction was absolutely hilarious.
I've not seen it, but I did do a video. I bet it is. You know, he's got I guess what they call in Russia a punktik. You know, he's absolutely obsessed with this. He's obsessed with the erasure of Ukraine, and if you can't erase it, then at least, you know, take the Donbass. This has become an absolute mantra for him, even though it strategically is nonsensical. I mean, no one, frankly, in Russia cares about these places. And even Tatiana Kim, the owner of Wildberries, has just apparently come out with a statement, or that may have been a parody, I don't know, that just said basically, I'm done. And no one gives a damn about, you know, Tochmach or whatever, or little villages in Ukraine. Who gives a damn about taking little heaps of rubble and villages when this digital economy is being swept away? And I think the irony is that this war was begun to supposedly demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. What it's doing is demodernizing and de-digitizing Russia itself, as well as demilitarizing Russia too.
I'm on mute. No, I think that I don't really know even where to begin on the Russian economy. The interest rates are 21%. I think they're going to make a further cut in that or shift in that soon. There was a report I was reading in the Moscow Times, you know, Russians are pulling out cash at unprecedented levels, right? Because they just don't trust the system anymore. They don't want to be in the financial system.
And oligarchs have been taking money out in unbelievable quantities in whatever liquid assets they can exchange it into. Hence why, you know, things like gold, silver, etc., are starting to be monitored by the regime. They want to stem the flow. Now, I want to throw an idea at you, because I think this is, you know, whereas the digital consumer economy is going to be destroyed over the coming weeks and months, in fact, we're well into that, there is unfortunately an area where Russia has excelled, and that will come into its own soon, I think, and that is digital tyranny, the architecture of creating a digitized authoritarian state. Now, China has obviously built one, and a lot of that technology has come from China, some of it's come from the West. But it seemed that earlier in the year, with these sort of websites going down and strange events in Moscow, it does seem that the infrastructure of digital authoritarianism has absolutely been built. That cannot be eroded, because it, you know, largely, yes, it's infrastructure, but it's decentralized infrastructure. It's controlled by the a wing of the FSB, at least. And I think, you know, looking at whose video was it? It was Mark Fagan talking to, I can't remember his name, it wasn't Tereshkin, but it was somebody else. They were talking about why immobilization is almost certainly inevitable. One, because of Putin's attitude that you just mentioned there, and you know, his reaction in Kazakhstan. The other one is that they have built the machine of digital repression, so that when the time comes, you know, you'll see the barriers go down, like a bank being robbed. You know, all of the security barriers are going to go down. The airports will be closed. The borders will be closed. People won't be able to drive, buy fuel, do anything, because the architecture of a digital authoritarianism is in place to stop people fleeing a full mobilization. Now, it's not guaranteed, but unfortunately, I think it's increasingly likely to come later this year. Many have said that he will wait until the elections are done. That's a sort of veneer of, dare I say it, validation for him, even though that will be completely falsified. But this is where I think it's going. And unfortunately, yeah, Russia is a leader, not in consumer digital anymore, but in the digitalization of repression.
Yeah, I like to think of what Russia would have been like. I think there's a lot of potential there. But on the mobilization front, I think it's pretty clear that we're going to see a significant shift in the fall. Putin's in a trap. He has, either way, he can't win. He either calls mobilization and therefore has to admit that the war is failing, or he doesn't, but the war fails. So the front line collapses. So he has a tricky play. And as you say, this time they've put in a lot of procedures to ensure that you don't see an exodus like you did in 22 with
Correct,
Georgia
yeah.
and those massive tailbacks that we saw.
Yeah.
So
I mean, they've built the architecture to stop the outflow of money. I think that's also crucial. They will be able to shut down all the banks, all the cash points, all the exchange points. The shutters will just suddenly come down and no one will be able to shift their money. So, it harks back to what you just said. People are taking out cash because I think many, and not the ones recording the TikToks, but there are many people who kind of know what's going on, and using VPNs, they'll be watching people like Mark Fagan, Michael Naki, Plushev and others. I mean, this is not just something I foist on Ukrainians, but there is some decent information within the Russian, let's say, diaspora sphere. And I do know that many people within Russia itself, via VPNs, do watch relatively good information.
what do you think about these developments as well inside Russia about the shift in, well, is it Ukraine? Oh, no, there was a shift in. Well, let's move to Ukraine because I'll come back to that thought if I can remember. There's so many thoughts running around my head. What do you think of what's been happening in Zelensky's shift? How should we call it? Reshuffle, reappointments. What's your thoughts on these developments?
This has been a long time coming. So people are focused, I think, and a lot of people get quite anxious in the West, like, oh, how can this happen in wartime? How can people have protests? When you're there and you're speaking to Ukrainians, it is the most natural thing. It is a key part of their culture to have, I would say, marketplace democracy, going back to the election of hetmans, etc. When Ukrainians feel that their leaders are not representing them, they give them a little nudge. If that nudge doesn't work, they find new leaders. This is what's happened over and over again over the last couple of decades. Of course, in wartime, it's a little more difficult, but actually it's led to something quite interesting, which is absolute direct democracy, which I'm not sure we have something quite like that, which is people are incredibly well informed about what's going on in the army, what's going on in ministries such as the Ministry of Digital Transformation. They pay a lot of attention to this detail. They discuss it. And then when they see the tendency going in the wrong direction, they feel that their voices have to be heard. They feel they have agency in the system, and they feel that people who perhaps in power have forgotten they represent the people need to be reminded of that fact. I think it's heartening that Zelensky reacted very quickly. He realized that he's not going to win against this. He also perhaps realized that maybe he'd made a mistake and that there's another course of action, which is more beneficial to the war. It'd be interesting if we ever get the transcripts of those conversations. My surprise actually is a little bit different, is that the length of time it took. Sierski's been in charge for a couple of years. There's been a lot of disquiet about his management. One could say that, yes, he was involved in the defense of Kiev, but he wasn't the only one. We can't just give that victory to him. But okay, that was positive. He was involved in retaking Kherson. Again, a positive, but partly, that opportunity was squandered. We don't know whether it was him or not, but they failed to really press home. They could have gone further. They could have surrounded a lot more Russians. I think it was allies probably put pressure on to stop. Kursk was very, you can say that was his plan, his idea, and it was incredibly bold. But again, the retreat from Kursk was chaotic, and a lot of people and equipment were lost, perhaps unnecessarily. So people are aware of many of these things, and to me it's a surprise perhaps that he's lasted so long, not the manner of his departure.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I hadn't really learned much about him until more recently with Kursk, and I think this is just a demonstration of old versus new guard in some ways. It's about time that we need a reallocation of seniority, of responsibility, and to bring in these new ideas. That, I mean, the war itself has changed. Maybe in the first couple of years or the first phases, it was the correct way. But now, as the war has become a lot more fast-paced, a lot more modernized with drone-led methods, you need people who understand and have been at the pioneering end of that technology to be in the face.
I'd go further than that and say that neither Fedorov nor Drapati have all the answers. No one does, because this is incredibly fast moving. And when you take risks, mistakes will be made. And I think it's inherent, it has been traditionally inherent in the hierarchical military and indeed in the administrative culture of Ukraine, as it is in many large bureaucracies, that people are risk averse. Because if you take risk and you happen to make a mistake, you won't be lauded for the successes. You'll be hung out to dry for the mistake you make, even if that mistake is, let's say, minor compared to your successes. So there's a risk aversion built in, and that is amplified in the traditional military. Well, the challenge here is that if no one exactly has the right answer, but everyone perhaps has pieces of the puzzle, you need to communicate. You need to have dialogue. You need to have vigorous debate. You need to have people who are willing to test, take risk, and even fail, and support each other so they can come back and try again. It seems that behind the scenes, Sersky and Fedorov not only could not have this dialogue, but actually there was no dialogue. There was, what do you call it? Sometimes I just get the Russian one in my head, preparatstvia. There was just barriers in the way from both sides. That in itself is a problem, because if you need to iterate and debate and experiment, well, that wasn't happening with these two individuals at loggerheads. And that has to be broken. Hopefully, Zelensky understands that it's releasing the energies of a process and ecosystem. It's not necessarily even about, two individuals.
How do you feel about the new appointment? How do you think it's going to go ahead?
All I can say, so I don't know who's replacing Fedorov or if he's going to be brought back, but when it comes to the Drapati, I can only echo what my Ukrainian friends tell me. And in some ways, maybe it's not for me to have an opinion on that. I can only go what they experience. And I've spoken to some people who've directly served under him, who've even met him and had interactions with him, and it is fairly universally positive. Not just positive. I think some people in the military are dare I say, cock a hoop. They absolutely expected a kind of halfway candidate between Drapati and Sersky to be appointed. They never actually believed that this could happen, and that someone with direct combat experience and who's shown, extraordinary courage, but also extraordinary leadership and responsibility would be given that role. I think it's going from the pit of despair a week ago when Fedorov was removed. I think many Ukrainians are now they're back on a kind of peak of optimism. Let's hope he lives up to that. But there are some good signs. I mean, when he wasn't even directly responsible for it. When something went horribly wrong, I think about a year or so ago, he took the fall for it, even though there were many layers of command and other people between him and this poor decision. He took responsibility for it. So he seems to me to be an individual with very high moral standards and leadership characteristics. So let's hope. I mean, certainly if you judge by the Russian propagandists, they were jubilant when Fedorov was let go, and now they are in the pits of despair. What do you call it? Zednityo, or the whining and the whinging from propagandists has reached a new pitch with the appointment of Drapati. That must be a good thing as well.
Yeah, the watching Telegram, watching some of the blogger reactions to what's going on inside Russia, as well as these developments in Ukraine. They've tried to spin it as sort of the country's losing control, but not really, because there's been protests held and it's in wartime, right? So it's fine. It's
exactly. And they wouldn't understand it, would they? They wouldn't understand that actually a functioning democracy is one that has pressure valves, one where the people have a sense of agency and involvement in decision taking, and where the populace are well informed and express themselves on the street based on that. If you're in amongst the protests, and I was explaining this to a couple of people, I've been on a couple of Brexit protests here in the UK, and even though they're very, good humored, etc., the amount of mess on the street that's left afterwards in any protest in the UK or Europe is fairly horrendous. It makes you think, hang on a second, where's the civic responsibility here? Why aren't people staying to clean it all up? That doesn't happen in Ukrainian protests. They come, they protest, they sing, they have prayers, as the one I saw, they chant, and then after the protest is gone, you'd never know they were there, because there's no spilt drinks and there's no chewing gum on the floor and there's no cans and bottles left behind. People come along and they have extraordinary, let's say, civic mindedness, not just in their participatory democracy, but how they treat the environment when they do those protests. No violence, no angst, no confrontation. This is a lesson, perhaps, I think, for democracies around the world. Maybe we all need something a little more direct, that the Ukrainians seem to be a core part of their culture. Russians, let's say, broadly speaking, have no comparable, let's say, sort of culture or experience. And I think it will be something of a mystery to many, even those that are not necessarily, pro-Putin. They'll look at this and scratch their heads.
Yeah, I think that's from my experience of going there and speaking to friends or family or whatever. I think it's sometimes the latter, that they are aware of it, but they kind of just prefer a more centralized form of governance. They don't look at democracy and sort of think it's going to function very well. They think that for the country to progress and be stable, I think a lot of Russians prefer stability over necessarily
Yes.
freedoms. And so they think, well, we're quite happy to forego some of our freedoms if it means we've got a strong figure and therefore Putin is our
Yes.
protector. But that's not
That's
happening.
never worked out, though. I mean,
No.
I could acquaint them with their history that demonstrates that has never worked out, and the stability is only temporary, and that all the benefits of that stability are lost generationally, because if you don't work on your, let's say, political process, then there is no long-term continuity or stability. I mean, I've seen enough of these myself directly to understand how that works.
Yeah, I would say, look, I mean, democracy is messy, but democracy often in times of strife, like we're seeing right now, not just in the war in Ukraine, but everywhere, tends to come out. It tends to persevere. But I want to get your take. You reminded me of the thing I wanted to ask you about. What's going on with MAGA, Jonathan? What's Luma being on the other side? What's going on with all these U-turns from Tim Pool and others?
Given that I know the people directly involved with getting Luma over to Ukraine, this is the result of a very, very long-standing process of trying to engage MAGA, which for much of that process seemed hopeless. And those who were engaged in it were shunned and derided by many in the community. I've tried not to be or let left-right sort of politics get in the way of the concept of Ukrainian victory. So I've worked very closely with those same people and tried to give them the space to do these experiments, even though I have to admit I myself didn't believe it could achieve something like this. I think it's almost, one could say, it's the inevitable outing or failure of Russian methodology here, which is that the money is starting to run out. Let's be a little bit cynical here. I don't think it's the case with Luma, because I don't think she was paid to believe these things and say these things, but I think it has been up until now entirely politically expedient for her to do so and for use these as a cudgel against her enemies. And she's still in the process of working through these demons and these lies that have penetrated, her worldview. As you could see by the questions she asked, if anything, the questions were even worse than those that Lex Friedman asked. And, in my view, those were pretty bad and a wasted opportunity. But she's trying to, break out of the bubble that she's fallen into. But it was one that was also extremely politically expedient. Now it's become less so, because I think the world is far clearer. Those who are still spouting Russian narratives are either deeply delusional, or actually more realistically now, they're the ones who were completely compromised by being paid to do so. It's interesting that Tim Pool is somewhere in the middle, because clearly he received, or organizations he was involved in received funds to do that. I would say perhaps, firstly, those who are still receiving funds, or those who have drunk so deeply of the cup of Russian, largesse and lies that they can't extricate themselves, going to carry on with this. Or if it's expedient for them to continue the grift, they probably recognize that they will continue to be amplified by Elon Musk and others, and potentially indirectly by digital investment by Russia to help amplify their platforms and voices, and that will result in revenue. Tucker Carlson is an obvious one, the InfoWars guy, Alex Jones, etc., Candace Owens. The minute someone like Luma turns, and this has been logged by Pekka Kaliniemi quite well, her audience crashed on X. Literally, it was like a bubble bursting. So I think many of the pro-Russian voices are amplified by money that is directly or indirectly coming from Russia or Russian-aligned actors, and that helps to keep their revenue streams afloat. That's not the case with Laura Loomer. What she has seen is, and she remains a deep Trump loyalist, she's seen that those who are attacking Trump now are quite clearly and overtly funded, I would say, long-term and maybe short-term by Russian money and Russian interests and Russian aligned interests, and that's what's triggered her. It's that's what's triggered her moment. So one could say that it is still politically expedient for her. This isn't. I mean, it is a come to Jesus kind of moment, but it also is directly related to her pro-Israel, pro-Trump stance and her pro-war stance. I think it's also the Iran war has caused the ecosystem shift and change in a way that is much more clearly delineated, and has caused quite a number to shift their position. Ben Shapiro was the first one to flip, again, extremely pro-Israel, anti-Iran point of view, and she's the next one. And that seems to be quite a decisive issue in pulling the scales from some people's eyes. But they've got a long way, let's face it, they've got a long way to go in unprogramming themselves from all the sort of nonsense they seem to have believed.
Yeah, I think there's perhaps an also a simpler argument one could make, which is that Trump likes winners. And right now, Ukraine is winning. They're certainly doing better than Russia is. And Trump seems to have come round. Don't worry, audience, I'm not getting too carried away. Some of my viewers get annoyed when I think, oh, Trump's turned a corner. No, I've learned my lesson on that one. But what I mean is that he seems to be more on the sort of, well, okay, Ukraine, yeah, they seem to be doing better sort of vibe. And so is it a case of just because Trump's pivoting a little bit, all his followers, cultists, are following as well?
It could be even simpler than that, is that I think for a long period of time, Trump was convinced that there was a big payday in supporting Russia, that there were big opportunities, commercial opportunities, grifting opportunities, and it's now less obvious to him. Now, that is aligned or twinned with the idea that Ukraine's winning and Russia's losing, but he can't help to see all this Russian wealth going up in smoke. And it's not that he feels sorry for them in any way, but he sees that, one, as losing, but two, as, hang on a second, how am I going to grift off this if they've got no money and they're ground into the dirt and their economy is collapsing? So this probably has undermined some of the narratives that Kirill Dmitriev, for instance, was very successful in pushing from Anchorage, well, before Anchorage, but especially around the sort of Anchorage summit and after, which is that there's a huge payday in dealing with us. Now, we don't know, how many of those schemes are still potentially viable. We don't know how many schemes related to the Middle East and states of the Middle East that may be partially supportive of Russia. And Jared Kushner and the other guy, Witkoff, are still probably sniffing around for deals. They're certainly, I think, not really focusing on peace. That's not, never was, the prime focus of their activity. But they'll probably be reporting back to Trump and saying, well, you know what? There aren't really deals here because it's all going up in smoke. And even if there were, there's a good chance the Ukraine would sink or burn whatever assets we were able to grift on. So again, we come back to Ukraine and its ability to take the fight to the enemy and to sanction Russia in a way that no Western country has even had the imagination, let alone the balls, to do.
No, certainly. So what do you think we are going to see? Because August always seems to be a bit of an interesting month. We had the counteroffensive 4 years ago, and we've had a couple of other developments in the past couple of years. Do you think we're going to see anything specific on the battlefield during the next month?
I expect not, simply because we're dealing now with a battlefield that is absolutely saturated with drones, and that Ukraine has edged ahead in terms of the volume of drones. I can't talk to whether the capability has increased over and above the Russian capability. I do know that this sort of infamous Rubicon brigade has really struggled to build the numbers that were proposed for it. So I think Russia's having trouble recruiting meat for the meat waves, but it's also having trouble recruiting elites for the so-called elite drone battalions. In the absence of those capabilities or being able to scale those up, I can't see how they would make any kind of dramatic offensive. And indeed, the number of pressure points that they can bring force to bear on across the front has decreased dramatically this year compared to last year and the year before. So their ability to exert force seems to be waning. Therefore, I wouldn't expect to see an awful lot. What they are doing, of course, is I would say the vindictive and terror strikes are changing their pattern. And I was in Kiev for the first of those, where instead of drones coming in, you have waves of ballistics, then punctuated with a brief rest, and then more waves of ballistics. And in fact, the terrifying thing of those is that you'd hear the explosion before you'd hear the air alarm go off. So there's absolutely no chance to get to a shelter. And once it's kicked off, you really are inclined to stay put rather than go anywhere. So I see these terror attacks ramping up. We see them in Sumy with cabs and the sort of guided aerial bombs. We see it in Kharkiv. Had a terrible week last week. Just after I'd left there, actually. And in Zaporizhia and Kherson, it's just being turned into a hell on earth. Well, that's all Putin can do is take out his vengeance on civilians, and that's I expect to see more of it. They're also attriting petrol stations in frontline areas and in Kharkiv as well. They've obviously everything, the ring road's been taken out, but they're starting to try take out petrol stations. But honestly, Ukraine is mirroring that tactic and doing the same in Belgorod and Kursk as well. So I think what we'll see is the creation of kill zones or buffer zones in both Ukraine and Russia, where it's increasingly untenable for civilians to live, and it's becoming more and more untenable for military logistics to operate as well.
Well, that was my last question, really, which was, in the time that you were there, what was the sentiment amongst the average Ukrainian you spoke to, amongst friends, those who are in the know? How do they feel about the inroads that the Ukrainians have been making into Moscow, bringing the war home to Putin?
I mean, certainly it helps to lift people's mood, but it's a roller coaster, isn't it? You're sleep deprived. Ukrainians are sleep deprived from these new wave strikes. No one knows, when they're being frank, whether they're going to survive this war. And unfortunately, we get more and more news. Just yesterday, news of people in my circle who either passed or had relatives who were killed in yesterday's strike. So this is coming home very directly to every individual. Everyone has people serving in the military. So on the one hand, you've got this extreme kind of exhaustion, this sense that is anyone going to get out of this alive? On the other hand, you do have a certain sense that the balance of power is shifting towards Ukraine. You certainly have the sense Ukraine is not going to give up. You also have, and I'll end on this, I think this is quite useful. You also have the sense that actually people are not minded to want to negotiate or freeze the lines at this point. Of course, they want this to stop. No one asked for this war. No one asked to become soldiers or to be compelled to kill other humans who are coming to try and kill your family, steal your home, rape your women, and defile your land. No one asked for that. But given that that is the reality, I think most Ukrainians who think about this want to finish the job. They want to finish the job, and that means destroying Russian imperial ambition and expelling Russia entirely from sovereign Ukrainian lands. So that's one maybe for the future for us to discuss. But negotiations, not necessarily popular here. No one believes that Russia would be under Putin certainly, would be a genuine negotiation partner. No one believes he would stick to any kind of armistice or freezing of the lines. So I think they're inclined to finish the job, I think is the operative phrase there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember, in the times that we've looked at polls, there were a couple of times during the past couple of years when more Ukrainians were open to the idea of talks, and it seems to have come full circle with the progress that's been made in the technology and the capacity to take it to Putin. That seems to be reinvigorating the idea of we don't need to talk. Actually, we can deal with this through kinetic means. Which is quite incredible.
They also see reality, which unfortunately many Western politicians really are minded not to. They see the reality that Putin doesn't want peace. He doesn't need peace. He doesn't want peace. He's got himself into a corner where peace would probably mean his demise and that of his regime. Ukrainians see this plainly without, let's say, wishful thinking, which clouds, I'm afraid, the judgment of many analysts and so on in the West. They just see it plainly for what it is. Russia must feel a historic defeat, and they must feel it keenly, and it must be incredibly painful for them economically, on a human level and every other level. It must be humiliating, historically humiliating, so that they will never try this again. And I think Ukrainians understand this absolutely. And I've been saying this right from the very start, that actually defeat of Russia is the only way to prevent future invasions of this type.
Certainly the war would end tomorrow if the Russians simply left, which they can always do, but
They can always do
they
this,
won't.
yeah.
But
Exactly.
Jonathan, it's been a pleasure as always to work with you and to have a chat. And everyone watching, do of course check out Jonathan's work, and we'll have to reconvene and do this again very soon. But
We certainly will. We won't have a shortage of things to talk about, that's for sure.
No, but everyone watching, of course, do check out our channels, do check out the Substacks, and we'll speak to you soon. And good luck out there, everyone. Take care.